Hi, everybody. This is your lecture on poetry. In this lecture, I'm going to lead you through a close reading and annotation of one of the few poems I did not ask you to annotate yourselves in the wiki assignment that's functioning in lieu of a quiz. This way, I'm not stepping on anyone's toes. In showing you how to annotate, we'll also end up reviewing large parts of the poetry annotation handout that I provided. I'm going to go pretty far in depth with this poem, and it's a model of what I'd like you to be able to do eventually. I also have to tell you that it took me a very long time to put this presentation together and to understand the poem. More than a day, maybe more than 2 days. This is not something that you can do quickly, so give yourself enough time when you work on your wikis and make sure you work together with your group members because many hands make light work. You may not go so far on your own annotations as I do in this presentation, but I'd like you to really strive for it. Or maybe you read poetry all the time and you'll do an even better job than I can. So, I'm totally open to that. I'd love to see it. So let's see what you can figure out, or what we can figure out together about this complex poem, Sonnet 96. The first step in understanding a poem is obviously to read it out loud. Poetry is so much about sound that it's very hard to understand it without reading it out loud. After I read it once, I'm going to ask you to think about what the tone is, and then I'll let you know what I think the tone is, and then we're going to identify the speaker and also the object, the you, in the poem. Some say thy fault is youth, some wantonness. Some say thy grace is youth and gentle sport. Both grace and faults are loved of more and less. Thou makest faults graces that to thee resort. As on the finger of a throned queen the basest jewel will be well esteemed, so are those errors that in thee are seen to truths translated and for true things deemed. How many lambs might the stern wolf betray, if like a lamb he could his looks translate? How many gazers might thou lead away, if thou wouldst use the strength of all thy state? But do not so. I love thee in such sort as, thou being mine, mine is thy good report. So what do you think about the tone here? I think there are a couple of clues. The exclamation points in lines 10 and 12, and also the two comparisons in the second quatrain and in the third quatrain. The comparisons to a queen and the comparisons to a wolf, or a wolf in sheep's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah, that's what it is. I think that the tone is, at first at least, kind of playful, and then at the end of the poem, somewhat moralizing. The poet is telling the young man who's the object of the poem, the you in the poem, that he wants him to change his behavior because his reputation, both of their reputations are at stake. So it's kind of moralizing at the end. It's telling him, you're not really behaving properly. It's not becoming of you. The next step is to think about what who the speaker is. So generally in a love poem such as this one, it's not quite a love poem because the speaker is kind of angry with the you in the poem, but we tend to call the speaker the I, the lover, or the poet. Please don't confuse the poet in the poem with Shakespeare. The poet in the poem, the speaker, is a character that Shakespeare created in these sonnets. So it's not necessarily, we have no evidence to say that they're the same. As far as the object of the poem, the you, or the thou in this poem, there are lots of different interpretations of this. Some scholars believe that the poem is about a lover. It could be, somebody that Shakespeare admired or an actual lover of Shakespeare's. It's obviously a man because Sonnet 96 is part of the series of Shakespeare's poems addressed to a fair youth, which means a young man. This might have been Shakespeare's patron, but he was not really so young at the time, so many critics reject that idea. One interpretation that I've read that I think is really interesting is that it's not to a lover at all, but it's written to an illegitimate son of Shakespeare's whom he refused to publicly acknowledge. but that he acknowledged him in his own way in this poem, telling him, hey, I watch you, I know what you're doing, and you're behaving sort of improperly. And even though you're not my legitimate son and I haven't recognized you, what you do still reflects on me, and I'd like you to change your behavior. So it might be that. I think that's a very interesting, kind of fanciful interpretation. Or there's a third interpretation, which says that it might not even be a person at all, that the you in the poem is actually a poem itself, or the idea of poetry. And in this way, Shakespeare has the opportunity to comment on his own writing and his own poems and kind of playfully critique himself and say, I know that my poems have a lot of flaws, but in the end, I'm happy with them and I love them anyway. So it could be a meta-literary poem as well, that it's actually a poem about poetry, which is quite common at this time period. So that's a very tempting interpretation as well. It's one that I particularly like. But again, we have no idea, because Shakespeare did not leave, any detailed instructions about how to read his poems. Moving on with our interpretation of the poem, we're going to look in this slide at, from the handout on explicating or annotating poetry, number 2, the literal content of the poem, as well as number 3, identifying the theme or central idea and the message of the poem, and we'll also determine the structural and rhetorical units into which the poem is divided. And I want to do this in reverse order, to start with the structure of the poem. So the structure is of a typical sonnet. There are natural divisions in the poem that are amongst 4 lines. So the first 12 lines are divided into 3 groups, and each group is called a quatrain. Each group of 4 lines is called a quatrain. The poem ends with a couplet, a group of 2 lines. There are also divisions in the poem when you read it that are based on the line endings. The first and third quatrains contain all end-stopped lines, which means that there is punctuation at the end of each line, asking you to pause. It's another natural division. The second quatrain and the couplet are enjambed, meaning that there's no natural pause when you get to the end of the line, and you just continue on to the next line. So you can hear the difference. So I'll read from quatrain 2. I'll read quatrain 2 and the couplet, and you'll hear the enjambment. As on the finger of a throned queen the basest jewel will be well esteemed, so are those errors that in thee are seen to truth translated and for truth things deemed. So you heard that there was a pause after line 6, esteemed, because there's a comma there, but then except for needing to breathe a little bit, you try not to pause after queen and after seen in lines 5 and 7. And that's because the poem just makes much more sense when you don't pause there. And that's called enjambment. It happens again in the couplet. But do not so, I love thee in such sort as, and there's the pause, thou being mine, mine is thy good report. So you generally have to follow the punctuation in the poem. Now let's move on to the theme. This one's going to be more apparent after we've talked about the vocabulary and the rhetorical devices, but I'll tell you that many Shakespeare plays and poems and a lot of the literature of the same era, the early modern period in England and Europe, use this same main theme, and that's the idea that appearances are often deceiving. It's the wolf in sheep's clothing idea. Is the young man more like a queen or like a vicious wolf? Or is the wolf only behaving like wolves do, and the queen is actually lying and cheating with her fake jewelry? We don't know, because Shakespeare seems to have believed that nobody is above reproach, and nobody is so perfect that their actions and motivations shouldn't be questioned. At the time, it was commonly believed, and this idea was propagated by the monarchy, that the monarchy was infallible, that they ruled by divine right, that God appointed them king and queen, and that they couldn't do anything wrong. But Shakespeare's always breaking the rules, and he questions that and says, is there any person in the world who is above reproach? Is there anybody who does not do things that sometimes require being criticized? So the young man in the poem, in being compared to a queen or a wolf, also implies that the wolf and the queen are also being compared in an interesting way. At the same time, the poem, as I said before, may be about writing poetry. And that's another big theme here. The poet is admitting to us that poems can also be deceptive sometimes. There can be good and bad in them, and even a celebrated poet like Shakespeare sometimes makes mistakes. So this is a poem about flaws, and it's possible that this poem is also questioning what makes good poetry. And can a poem about flaws that also contains flaws still be a good poem? And Shakespeare could be struggling with that question for himself. Now I want to take a step back actually and look at the literal content of the poem, what each quatrain and what the couplet do. I've already said that the object of the poem is either a young man, whether a lover or a son, or the poem itself. The first quatrain lays out the main ideas of the sonnet: fault, youth, wantonness, but also grace and amusement. The poet points out that very many people, the more and less in line 3, love the young man who is amazing in his ability to even make his flaws seem like virtues. The second quatrain uses a simile to make a comparison. Whatever a queen wears will be considered the height of fashion and full of value, even if it's cheap and fake. In the same way, the poet says, the young man is admired even when he's flawed. In the same way, in the third quatrain, there's another comparison. Here the young man is being compared to a wolf in sheep's clothing who anthropomorphically dresses up like a sheep and seduces the whole flock before he kills them. Here the young man is compared to the wolf, right? And the poet asks, how many people could the young man seduce if he really wanted to? A lot is the implied answer. Everyone loves the slightly foolish and careless young man, and everyone thinks he's perfect. In the couplet at the end, the poet brings the poem back to himself. That's where we first see the word I, is in line 13. The poet tells the young man that he loves him, but that his flaws also reflect on the poet. So that has the dual purpose of kind of moralizing and admonishing the young man for behaving badly, and at the same time brings and this leads me to my interpretation, to agree with it's not mine, I didn't make it up, but agree with the interpretation that this is a poem about poetry because it brings the poem back to the poet itself with that use of the word I. In this slide, we're going to look at the vocabulary in the sonnet. I put the sonnet in the middle, and pretty soon as we go through it, it's going to be completely covered because there's a lot of vocabulary here. I think a lot of you know this already, but just in case, when the poet refers to the object, he uses the old informal version of our word you. Just like in other languages, in English there used to be a distinction between you and thou. And thou was actually the informal. It's how you would address somebody you know, or a family member, somebody you know well, a family member or a child or an animal. Thee, thou, thy, and thine were these informal pronouns, and eventually they fell out of use, and the formal you became used for both. The next word that I want to look at is wantonness. Wantonness can mean a whole lot of different things, and apparently this is the only time that Shakespeare uses this form of the word. He uses wanton and wantonly in other poems. But this is the first time and the only time that he uses it in the sonnets, and I thought that was interesting. Wantonness can mean recklessness, wildness, capriciousness, which is being moody, but here it's more likely that Shakespeare is referring to sexual connotations of promiscuity. If the poem is about a lover or a son, if we take it that way. The next word that you might want to look up is this idea of gentle sport. I think the best interpretation of this is a kind of That kind of terrible sexist thing that people say, like, oh, well, boys will be boys, kind of sexual license that today we would probably call harassment, but for a long time was kind of laughed off. And we were told, like, oh, it's okay because he's just being a boy, right? Because it's in that second line where some people say that his grace, his virtue, is his gentle sport, the way that he expresses himself sexually, and that it's not a bad thing, that it's a good thing the way he does it. But of course, it's contrasted to the word wantonness. So other people say, like, no, his promiscuity is terrible, it's reckless. The next word you might I had to look this one up actually, more and less, and I learned that it refers to both upper and lower class people who love the young man. So this young man is universally adored regardless of who's looking at him. Next is resort. I find this one kind of tricky because in my mind, I conjure up an image of a fancy hotel on a beach when I hear the word resort, but it has nothing to do with that. It means to convert into or to become. So, in other words, all the young man's vices turn into perceived virtues. But it can also, and I think this is a really important interpretation as well, at the same time, it can literally mean to resort or recategorize ideas. And in that way, it works almost like a metaphor if you imagine yourself, I don't know, holding a stack of index cards and reordering them, right? Because in the poem, the idea of virtue and flaw are being resorted by this young man. He can turn his vices into virtues. I think this one's pretty clear. I just wanted to talk about the pronunciation. The accent over the E in throned it shows us that it's pronounced throned, and the that is for the scansion, as on the finger of a throned queen. It just needs to be there for the line to fit in with the others in the meter, in the rhythm. It just means sitting on a throne. The basis jewel, you might know what this one means, but you might not. It just means least valuable. Base means low. Esteemed, that apostrophe is there to tell us how to pronounce it, that it's not esteemed, it's esteemed. And that just means has a high value. So notice the contrast. I'll talk about this in a minute when I talk about figures, but you have a contrast in this line, base and esteem, right? Low value, high value. Translated, of course, means decoded, but in this sense, it's also transformed or metamorphosed. And at the end of the last slide has a list of sources. So a critic called Wendler, points out that translation equals metaphor. So how are the truths being transformed, how are the errors being translated or transformed, metamorphosed or metaphored, if I can use that word, it's a made up word, into truth, right? Deemed, considered, or believed to be the same thing. The apostrophe is there to tell us that it's deemed and not deemed. The stern wolf is the harsh wolf, right? The vicious wolf. Translate again, but at this time around it means more like pretend. How many gazers mightst thou lead away? This is pretty common in the time period. It just means might. Might you? Would you be able to? But that st ending is just it is, you can ignore that. You can take it off in your mind and just read it as might. Same with wouldst, right? Just pretend that st isn't there. You pronounce it wouldst, but it just means would. And the strength of all thy state, this is a metaphor, which means with all your might, with all your power. I love the in such sort. We saw the word sort before in resort or resort. It's not clear which it is, but in such a sort just means in such a way this time. But do not so. I find this kind of ambiguous. It could mean don't pretend to be something that you're not, or it could also mean don't try too hard to be beautiful or good because I love you the way you are. Do not, so it's not clear what he's not supposed to do exactly. And finally, thy good report. Um, it could mean two different things. It could mean my opinion is the one that matters. Mine is thy good report. Could be, it's what I think that matters. Or it could also mean that thou being mine, mine is thy good report, could mean that since we're so similar, says the poet to the lover, be careful what they say about you because that'll also reflect badly on me. So we are one person, and this is in the love poetry of the time period. It's kind of a common thing to say we are one, right? Two people turning into one. And obviously that has sexual connotations to it, but also that in this case it's being used to remind the lover that if he has a bad reputation, that the poet will get one too. The next item is about rhyme scheme. Actually, the only thing that I'm going to say about the rhyme scheme is that it's not Shakespeare's best. And that could be because a lot of people say that Shakespeare didn't finish writing this poem, or that there was a printing error, and but we'll see why. I won't give it away. Maybe you can figure it out already what has to do with the rhyme scheme and what that means about its flaws. So when we talk about the rhyme scheme, we're not just talking about it just to point it out. We're talking about how the rhyme scheme reflects on the message of the poem or the structure or the tone. So it's an English sonnet. English sonnets almost always follow the same rhyme scheme, which goes as follows: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and G, G. What does this mean? So you'll notice that I tried as hard as possible to line up those letters with the lines of the poem. So that means that the endings of the lines have to rhyme in that particular pattern. So the two A's, wantonness and more and less, rhyme. The B's, sport and resort, etc. So the letters are arbitrary. They're just the letters of the alphabet that are used mathematically in a way to represent something else, which is the rhyme. So the first 12 lines are fine. You'll notice, right? And some of them are really quite beautiful. Wantonness and more and less, has a great sound to it. But the last couplet, this is where the problem is. And this is the one that some critics think that Shakespeare didn't write himself or didn't put there himself, in part because this same couplet appears in another sonnet. It's Sonnet 36. It looks like maybe it was just copied and pasted onto 96 as well. The last two lines, so we see A and A, B and B, C and C, D and D, esteemed and deemed, betray, away, translate, state. The G's, you'll probably already notice, are rhymes that we've seen before. It's actually the same as B. So we have sport, resort, sort, and report. Why, this very rarely happens. So maybe it's possible that this is deliberate, right? That these are actually B rhymes repeated again. Or we could say, it's kind of ironic because, as we saw before, as we're getting the idea that this poem is already about flaws. So, maybe Shakespeare deliberately put a flaw in there, and the rhyme scheme is supposed to reveal a potential flaw in the poem, kind of like a little clue of what this poem is really about. In any case, it's interesting. Now we're going to get to the really fun part, images. Remember that images are always concrete. They create a mental picture. So if I say trees, sunset, fire burning, you're going to have a really clear mental picture of what that looks like. Consider how the images are going to affect the tone, the theme, and the message of the poem. I'm going to read the poem again, and I'm going to stop on the images and talk briefly about each one. The tricky thing about this poem, though, is that there aren't very many images, as you'll see. So let's start. Some say thy fault is youth, some wantonness. Some say thy grace is youth and gentle sport. Both grace and faults are loved of more and less. Thou mak'st faults graces that to thee resort. Okay, so there's the first quatrain. And unless you have a picture in your mind of what wantonness looks like or youth, the only one that I might think of is grace, potentially. But that's only because in my mind, when I hear the word graces, I think of this painting of the goddesses, the Three Graces by Botticelli. But I don't think this is what Shakespeare meant at all. I think that graces are supposed to be more like virtues in a person. So I'm going to go ahead and say that there are actually no images in the first quatrain. Second quatrain, here we finally see images. So if you look at the fifth line, do you see what's the first image here? And this is why I said it was playful at the beginning. That's right. The first image is a finger, right? A finger. And that's kind of funny in a serious sonnet that the first image is a finger. But anyway, as on the finger of a throned queen, and here's a portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, who was queen at the time probably that Shakespeare wrote this sonnet, even though she died in 1603. It was published 6 years later, but he might have written it during her lifetime. As on the finger of a throned queen, the basest jewel will be well esteemed. So I put a little fake diamond ring on her there, just for fun. So are those errors that in thee are seen, to truths translated and for truth things deemed. No more images in this quatrain, unless you can tell me what truth looks like. I think we're all going to have different images of that. Third quatrain, there are more images, and look at how I represented them like this in a different color and a little bit bigger for a reason. Look at the arrangement of them and see, maybe you'll understand what I'm starting to get at. How many lambs? And I put a little picture of a flock of lambs there. Are you ready? How many lambs might the stern wolf betray? Isn't he vicious looking? How many lambs might the stern wolf betray if, are you ready? This is the best one. Like a lamb, isn't that adorable? Like a lamb, he could his looks translate. So it is for cute pictures, but it's also, I'm making such a big deal of this because I want you to look at the arrangement of the images. And I'll read the rest of the poem, but I'm going to tell you now that there really are not any other strong, concrete images. How many gazers might have, I considered this as gazers an image, but I don't have, I can picture people gazing up at the stars maybe, but I think we're going to have different pictures in our minds. I don't think this one is really intentionally an image. How many gazers mightst thou lead away if thou wouldst use the strength of all thy state? But do not so. I love thee in such sort as, thou being mine is thy good report. Again, report. I picture, I don't know, like a school report or something, not what Shakespeare intended. So let's leave it at this, that there are 6 concrete images in this poem and that they appear, notice how they're arranged in sort of almost like a circle around the center of the poem. When we read poetry, it's really important to think about where images or where different things are placed and the arrangement of it. So that's why I represented it to you visually like this. Notice that it's the first 2 lines of the second quatrain and the third quatrain, really the center of the poem with a void in between. And notice also the parallelism. We're going to talk about this. I'm going to show it to you again, represented a different way. But look at the parallelism. Finger and lambs kind of line up. Throned queen and the stern wolf line up. And basest jewel and like a lamb line up. So what's lining up here? we can ignore the finger and the lambs for a minute, but let's look at the other two, the throned queen and the stern wolf. These are both comparisons to the young man. The young man is first compared to a queen, right? Perfect, infallible, beyond reproach, someone who, no matter what she's wearing, is going to, everyone's going to think she's perfect. And the kind of vicious wolf that represents nature, but also always used in literature as a villain, right? So at the same time, the young man is perfect, and he's also a vicious wolf just looking to betray, is the next word on that line, the poor innocent sheep, right? And the basis jewel lines up with like a lamb. These are the two deceits, right? The base jewel is the fake jewel, or the thing that's being pretended, and you have another instance of pretending in the third quatrain, like a lamb. So this really, I want to emphasize a lot that these really line up. In the center of the poem, we don't have any images, but look at what they're framing. So are those errors that in thee are seen, to truth translated and for true things deemed. This is the real heart of the poem. Literally, it's the center two lines of the poem, and they're being framed by these images. And it's all about how flaws, how errors are so easily disguised under a beautiful veneer, and how deceptive appearances can be. Okay, the next step is to identify all the different kinds of figurative language that's used in the poem, and things are about to get a little crazy. So hang on, bear with me, listen. You might have to take a step back at some point, but the page is about to get very full. But I think it's gonna really show you all of the different kinds of figures that can appear in a poem, and that often do. So we already identified the images, right? But let's see what else we can find. Okay, so here are all of the figures that I copied from the handout about annotating poetry. And we already found the images. Here they are again. The finger, the throned queen, the basis jewel, the lambs, the stern wolf, and lamb. Now, if I were annotating this poem on paper, it'd be a lot easier. Trying to handwrite on PowerPoint, I don't recommend trying it. It was incredibly difficult, and that is not what my handwriting normally looks like. But I was using a mouse, and it was quite hard. This might be easier on an iPad, which I don't have. So when you do this, what you might want to do is print out the poem and just do this by hand. It would be a lot faster. So, okay, we found the images. Going through the list of figures, we do have an allusion. An allusion, remember, is a reference to something else. And in this case, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing, which is from the Bible, and is very clear. So I marked that on the left side of the screen. You see in those lines, how many lambs might the stern wolf betray? So that's an example of allusion. It's an allusion to a Bible parable about be careful of the wolf in sheep's clothing. There's another allusion that I didn't mark here, but it's the last two lines are possibly a deliberate allusion or possibly not. I said before that the last two lines, the last couplet of this poem, is a repetition of the last couplet of Sonnet 36 as well. That could be also considered an allusion. Okay, next, do we have any anaphora? And I think we do not. An anaphora is a kind of repetition. We have a lot of repetition in this poem, but I'm going to go ahead and say that it's not anaphora. The repetition of some say in the first two lines is more of just a plain repetition and also represents parallelism. And let's see. Let's see what happens here. Also, the images that I talked about before are another example of parallelism, but if I click that. Some say thy fault is youth, some say thy grace is youth. That's a real example of parallelism, which is a similar construction, but it's not as emphasized as an anaphora would be. Moving on, there is no apostrophe in this poem. And I would like to note, however, a kind of connotation. I talked about this a little bit before, but that the queen and the wolf represent certain things like power, beauty, nature. The wolf represents a viciousness. The queen is supposed to represent perfection, right? So here we have examples of connotation. And as we go through these, the terms on the right side of the slide are going to either turn blue if we have them in this poem, or going to get crossed out in red if they don't exist in this poem, or at least I can't find them. Send me an email if you do find some of these things, and I will correct it. We see a lot. The next one is contrast. We see quite a lot of contrast in this poem, actually, and it works in conjunction with the parallelism and the repetition. You'll see that repetition just turned blue as well. We have, for example, fault and grace in the first quatrain. The words fault and grace are repeated multiple times. So you have it in the first two lines. They're kind of far apart, but they line up visually. So I added a little arrow there. And then in the next instance, in the third line, they're together, grace and faults, this time inverted. Before it was fault, then grace, and now it's grace, then fault. And they're also connected by the conjunction and. The next time in the fourth line, they are again, so there it's what does it say? Contrast and repetition. In the fourth line, they are again inverted once again, faults and graces, just like in the first two lines, and we lose the conjunction. So they get, I think you'll notice this already, they start far apart and they get closer and closer together until they are right next to each other. So the next one, we have another contrast that I pointed out earlier, but I'll do it again here, is in line 6, the basest jewel will be well esteemed. So I put that one in with a brown arrow again here to show more contrast. And then another one, so are those errors that in thee are seen, to truths translated and for true things deemed. This one is actually kind of bi-directional here. It's a bilateral pattern from the quasi-repetition of truths and true things, and you see it in two ways. It goes from, I put arrows from errors attached to truths and then true things. It's kind of split apart, and that's significant too, that truths and true things, as if there's something different, right? Is truth different from true things? Shakespeare puts them separated here, and he puts the word errors right above them, right in the middle, and that continues to emphasize our main theme that appearances are deceiving, that anything that you call a truth is probably not, which is kind of a scary thought, of course. But isn't it also kind of true? We can see really how these contradictions are concentrated early on in the poem to drive this message home about appearances being deceiving. But let's move on. We already mentioned the use of end-stopped and enjambed lines. Those just turned blue. And just to visually represent them again, that you have the end-stopped, I just did it in the first two quatrains. I circled the punctuation at the end of the line to represent end stopping, and then you'll see queen. I put a little underline there and wrote enjambment. So why am I doing this? I want to show you how if you were holding a pen in your hand, you don't have to have all different colors. I just did that because it was fun and because I wanted you to be able to see as much as possible, as clearly as possible as this page fills up. but if you do it with a pen in your hand, it's going to go a lot faster, and you're going to be able to really play with it and write down. You should mark it all up. Okay, so the enjambment, I mentioned enjambment before, and end stop. What is the purpose of end stop and enjambment? Well, here it starts out really slowly. The first quatrain, you have to pause after each line. But then in the second quatrain, the poem builds tension with the faster paced and jammed lines of the second quatrain and the couplet. Right? So you have to say the poem a lot faster once you get to that second quatrain, and then it slows down again, and then it speeds up again in the final couplet. The next item is hyperbole. We do not have an example of hyperbole, which is an extreme exaggeration, but on the contrary, we do have the opposite of a hyperbole, which is called a litotes, which is found in the rhetorical question, how many gazers mightst thou lead away? And that is an example of ironic understatement. And I should have underlined that, but I don't think that I did. Let's move on to metaphor. The lambs and the wolf are examples of metaphor, whereas the queen is a simile, right? So I just kind of highlighted that with metaphor, and let's see, the lambs, the stern wolf, and then simile just kind of turned blue. And there it is, the simile. I wrote it in purple. And the simile is represented. We know it's a simile because the use of as and so. As is this, so is the young poet, the young lover, rather. And the metaphor of the wolf and the lamb, there's also another simile, if like a lamb. Let's see. There we go. Like a lamb. So that's another example of a simile there. The strength of all thy state is another metaphor right there. So I'm underlining that in yellow. I don't see any, let's see, parallelism was covered. I don't see any metonymy or oxymoron, but if you guys do, just, let me know. Periphrasis, similarly, I don't see any. Personification, we do have an example of personification, and that is of the wolf dressing up in sheep's clothing. And the wolf is being, just to say another moment about that, the Shakespeare seems to want to grant it the power of deception, even though we know that, the wolf is not deliberately, being vicious. It's just what wolves do. Wolves go after sheep, right? But here there's an anthropomorphism or a personification going on. And rhyme we talked about already earlier. And the rhythm, I'm not going to talk too much about the rhythm, only to indicate that this poem, like all English sonnets, are written in iambic pentameter, and you can look at that on the handout. I'm not going to talk too much about it. I just want to remind you, though, how much work goes into writing this kind of poem, where every line has to have 10 syllables and they have to follow a certain pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. But if you want a challenge, you can look at this poem closely and send me an email or put it in the discussion boards. Tell me which line of this poem does not scan correctly. There is one. And there's, yet another flaw in this poem about flaws, in this nearly perfect poem about flaws. Symbolism we've talked about in terms of image and connotation, so I think that we can leave it at that for now. And I don't see any synecdoches here. We do have one nice transposition. He could his looks translate. That's the wolf, right? Instead of saying he could translate his looks, it's he could his looks translate. Let's see, what is next here? Moving on to, now we're going to move on to the sounds that work as figures. So we do see some, there we go with the transposition underlined in red. We'd see some nice examples of alliteration here. It's amplified again by the repetition. For example, in the first two lines, some say thy fault is youth, some wantonness. So you can see the S sounds are really pronounced in these first two lines. And then another one with T sounds in line 8. To truths translated and for true things deemed, right? And then there's an assonance, the repetition of vowel sounds, and we see it in the middle of the poem, quatrain 2, and it is. I'm gonna highlight that it's the E sound, a long E sound. Queen, esteem, thee, seen, deemed. As on the finger of a throned queen, the basest jewel will be well esteemed. So are those errors that in thee are seen, to truths translated and for true things deemed. So you have a repetition of that long E. I don't see or I don't hear any other repeated sounds, but in any case, I'm out of colors and it's already quite a lot here. But there is more. I didn't talk about the last 4 lines very much at all. So if you want to find anything else in this poem, please let me know. Because we've already done so much explication already, I'm going to jump to item 11 on the handout, which is just by way of recapping what we've already talked about. How does each stanza and device or figure function in relation to the whole poem? I'm just going to highlight the ones that I think are the most important for the main theme. The main theme that Shakespeare explores throughout is the theme of appearances are deceiving. To illustrate this, we see the convergence of graces and faults in the diminishing distances between those words in the first quatrain, which we talked about before. And remember that as they get closer and closer together, the message that appearances are deceiving and that graces can look like faults, and moreover that flaws can look like virtues, is really driven home there. Then there's the use of the images to illustrate that same theme, right? We have the images that I just talked about in the previous slide, or the 2 previous slides even, the throned queen versus the stern wolf, and how the young man is being compared to both of them, and both of them are deceivers. That one of them is wearing this fake jewel and she's still believed to be of the highest value, and the other one is the wolf in sheep's clothing who's looking to deceive the flock of sheep. Finally, the last thing that I want to highlight here is the use of connotation to help us understand the main theme. We have those 2 connotations of the queen and the wolf there, right? The queen and the wolf both have virtues, but they both have strong flaws, and that's paralleled by the imagery as well. So if I were writing a paper on this poem, I'd focus on these 3 figures to illustrate the poem's meaning and theme. For your assignment in our poetry unit, I'm not asking you to write a paper. I'm asking you to annotate 2 poems in groups of 3 students. You can be creative in how you represent your annotations. PowerPoint, like I've done, can be really messy and hard to handle, so I honestly don't recommend it, even though I did it, but it took me a really long time. If you want to try it on paper, or maybe somehow if you have an iPad, it might work well on that, or take different kinds of screenshots working with your group, or maybe you could use a Google Doc. Again, you don't have to make it, colorful like I did. That was just for you to see the different kinds of figures clearly, and to distinguish between them. You can do it in any way that you want. Just work with your group and keep an open mind, and I'm sure that you're going to do a great job. Just jump right in there and start with your analysis. You don't need a formal conclusion or introduction or conclusion, but do remember that showing your work is the most important part. And I'm looking forward to seeing your annotations and seeing your discussions in the discussion board. So good luck with this assignment, and have a great week.